never really stopped to think about the races I was playing. Most of the time I played tabletop games like Pathfinder. Most of the time I was concerned with what stats the race gave, or the kinds of cool abilities that it had, usually locked behind feats. But when I would get to the point on my character sheet where I filled all the boxes except the part where I had to turn my numbers with a picture attached to it into a character, over time I came to appreciate races that gave me something distinct to work with, and I would lament the ones that gave me some stats and an aesthetic and told me to go wild. I learned that by doing a little bit of groundwork, a writer who was willing to sow the seeds would eventually lead to characters that flourish into a more cohesive and meaningful story down the line. Ever since then, I've strived to do that groundwork whenever I made a race, and I've grown more picky about how I choose which ones I include in my own tabletop game. Knickknacks. One of the most important things I think about when I make a race for a tabletop game is how it distinguishes itself from other races. This can be in terms of visual design, where they fit in society, their cultural differences, how they reproduce, what their upbringing is like, how long they live, the general opinions other races have towards them, and how typical interactions go. The more these types of features are prominent in a race, the better off you are when trying to distinguish a character. To showcase this, I'd like to look at a few examples that exist in D&D 5e that are considered core races. I'll also be considering other common depictions of these races. In general, I don't think 5e does a very good job of providing the spark people need to make stories centered around their race, and the general zeitgeist of a race contributes greatly to how well made the race is as well. First, I'd like to discuss what I think are poorly designed races in Halflings or Gnomes. If you think about what a gnome is, you probably think about some silly short person with a big pointy hat. The garden gnome. In the official D&D 5e books, gnomes are described as incredibly long-lived, living for centuries. They're forest people with an affinity for engineering and invention. When you think of halfling, you probably think of Lord of the Rings hobbits. Short people with an aversion to shoes and affinity for bravery. In the official D&D 5e books, they write things like, "They cherish the bonds of family and friendship, as well as the comforts of hearth and home, harboring few dreams of gold or glory." Let's start going down the list and seeing how these shorties do. Visual design. Gnomes and halflings have very small variations between each other, and more often than not end up looking like shorter, more eccentric humans. Gnomes, at the very least, are sometimes depicted with hair colors and exaggerated proportions that are unusual. But the art for Wizards of the Coast to showcase these races only serves to showcase the most distinct feature of both of these races. They are small. In terms of where they fit in society, both of these races are described as living in small, rural communities without much concern for the outside world. They have their shires and such they keep to themselves and their little projects. Both seem to have their own things going on. Gnomes with their personal projects and halflings just living their lives. In terms of cultural differences, this is where I think the most egregious example exists. Everything that is described about these two races can be found in the average rural human. Caring about family, liking good food. What is this? The dating profile of some 20-something Tinder profile? Halflings are literally small humans in this aspect. Gnomes are described as industrious creatures who never feel like they have enough time for anything. Again, this is already how most humans feel. How they reproduce? Well, I don't think that D&D races have a lot of distinctions when it comes to how they procreate. Good old sexual reproduction. I don't think this is a particularly bad thing for most races, but when everything is the same, everybody is worse because of it. And as far as upbringing is concerned, pretty much follows the same rules. Now, in terms of how long they live, something that has always annoyed me about fantasy is its propensity to throw around ancient beings everywhere all the time. With hundreds of years of life, that's something important to take into consideration with how society is shaped. how these ancient beings exist in the same world with creatures that are children, basically until the day they die. And how does 5e talk about gnomes and their age? Oh, well, they still don't feel like they have enough time for everything, so they talk fast and stuff. I know there isn't a lot written on these race pages in the first place, since mechanics are the important part, but this just makes me sad. General opinions that other races have, typical interactions. Apparently halflings keep a low profile, and halflings, unlike gnomes, also live amongst humans. I'm not saying that these are the only criteria of a race that you should consider when playing them. I'm not saying these additions are not sound mechanical additions to a fantasy RPG about killing monsters. What I am saying is that these two races are bland at best. Kind of like a modern Bethesda game. A starting point you can work with once you let the modders fix everything. If someone creative picks Gnome, they can come up with all kinds of weird character designs, I'm sure. Warcraft has certainly shown some of their potential. Unfortunately, if someone less creative gets their hands on a gnome character, all they have is like, I guess I'll play a gnome artificer because they build stuff. Halflings don't even have that. Even the name implies half-man, and the race certainly plays into that idea. Gnomes only exist as a silly aesthetic for meme characters outside of D&D, and halflings don't even exist at all outside of D&D. When making knickknacks, I used resources like the 5e player handbook, not only to decide race features, but also to help inform the kinds of stories that people can make. The lore that I write is a springboard to making their characters. For these two races, I was so uninspired that I didn't even want to include them. I borrowed a few racial features for ideas and other things and moved on. If you want to play a small character, I've got plenty of other much more interesting options, both mechanically and lore-wise. Now let's look at what I would consider a good fantasy race, included in D&D style games. Orcs. In general, orcs are described as brutish, aggressive, and separate from common society, civilized society. In many types of fantasy, they are the kinds of mindless drones that evildoers fill their front lines with. Orcs are synonymous with that which is tribal and violent. Let's run down the list. In terms of visual design, orcs immediately distinguish themselves from other races with their varying skin tones. Common depictions include green and gray, with a handful of red-skinned orcs in Warcraft. While many humanoids are capable of being large and muscular, it is the expectation that orcs are much larger and more intimidating than most other humanoids. Their faces are also striking. The shape of their skull is completely different by necessity in order to accommodate their large tusk-like teeth. Many depictions of them will also give them small or completely black eyes in order to lean into their more monstrous side, like what happens with the shark in Finding Nemo when he gets a whiff of blood. Just like the other races, how they reproduce is pretty standard, though if you ask the Japanese, orcs are a little less concerned with consent. In terms of cultural differences, orcs distinguish themselves by molding their entire society around conflict. They don't typically elect leaders, they have chieftains that have proven themselves in battles. Like gnomes and halflings, they live outside of society, but unlike those smaller races, this plays a large role in changing their culture. Orcs much more commonly domesticate dangerous beasts. They harvest bones and skin from their kills to craft their weapons, armor, and tools. They live more like Native American before the Europeans took over. And in terms of upbringing, a life of fighting to survive necessitates an upbringing where your tools of the trade are axes and swords instead of hammers and nails. Orcs aren't afforded the same kind of cozy and sheltered childhoods often experienced by other races. And they need to pick up quick or die by the claw of some savage beasts, by the hands of an enemy tribe, or worse yet, a member of their own tribe looking to take their spot. In terms of lifespan, orcs mature faster, die younger. This plays perfectly into their typical roles in fantasy as combat drones or as tribal people, living out in the dangers of a fantasy wilderness. In terms of interactions and opinions, this kind of law of the strong will naturally cause them to butt heads with other surrounding settlements. Minor infractions, such as intruding upon hunting grounds, can be perceived as an attack on their way of life. Orcs are also natural bullies, being larger, more powerful than other humanoids. Their generally more dubious morals, combined with their combat prowess, makes them perfect for mercenary work or living life as a bandit. As such, a common interaction with orcs is going to be them relieving you of your coin, or making you think twice about drawing your sword against a traveling merchant they're protecting. Overall, the lifestyle of an orc is very different from not only those that exist within the fantasy world, but one that is significantly different than our own in real life. It shares enough to be relatable while being distinct enough to where you can see some value in how they live. It's very commonplace for soldiers to be revered as the protectors of their country. Honor in battle is a common enough sentiment that we don't have to imagine some new alien mindset in order to play as an orc. Orc lifestyles also present an opportunity for players to think about things they might normally not. If you play as an orc barbarian that tears other people limb from limb, how do you come to terms with that? Is this normal enough to you that you don't think twice about killing before people kill you? Does it make you a ruthless killer? Or does it bring honor to your clan? A sign of a good race is that it lets you play into its archetype without having to think very much about it if you don't want to. But if you do want to, it also offers the opportunity to experience a different side of life. It's as deep as you want it to be. I think orcs have enough variety that you can play orc multiple times and come out with a different type of story each time. I've talked about examples that other people have made, but let's talk about one that I made. I didn't invent orcs. Just like pretty much everybody else, I've adapted them in many ways I think emphasizes their strong suits. So I don't think it would be very fair to dunk on D&D without providing an example of something that I have made myself. An original idea that exists elsewhere, but not quite like how I imagine it. The race is called Poplin, and they are a race of toy people. They are born alongside troubled children that need a friend. They never physically grow, but they can mentally grow alongside the child they're bonded to. Their bond. I'll go through the same bullet list of qualities that I went through with the other few races. In terms of appearance, Poplin are born as young children, and tend to be around the 3 feet tall range most small races are. Now we have a small race. Now to give them some more features. Poplin tend to be souls that inhabit the favorite toys of children, usually favoring dolls, action figures, and plushies. This can mean that Poplin can have a wide variety of appearance. They can be mostly plastic with ball joints and kung fu grip, or they can be fluffy teddy bears that squeak if you hug them too hard. While toys vary quite a bit in color, having them animate, walk, talk, and interact with people is enough to make them recognizable. Just so things don't get too creepy, you can imagine that they're animate in the same way Toy Story characters are, rather than the clunky mouth movement of, say, a Nutcracker. In terms of reproduction, Poplin don't possess the standard biology present in most humanoids that allows for reproduction. Poplin are more of a force of the universe, rather than a unified race of people. You can choose to make this force anything. I'd like to imagine there's some kind of powerful, benevolent creature like Santa Claus that gifts these creatures to needy children. Their spawn conditions are pretty consistent, always alongside a small child, and always one that's troubled. In terms of cultural differences, I think this is probably the weakest spot for Poplin, since they don't have a unified culture. They don't have control over when they're created, so they can't, advertise themselves to rich kids who want talking toys. The most I can say is, they mimic whatever they're born into. In terms of upbringing, Poplin tend to stay children, even as they age, often maintaining at least a little bit of that wonder and optimism found in children. However, if Poplin are separated from the child that they are bonded with for long periods of time, they might just end up misfit toys. Misfit in the sense that they want revenge for the cruelty inflicted upon them. So you can use misfit toys as villains just as well as you can use them as lifelong companions. In terms of lifespan, they are tied to a specific person, and when that person dies, so do they. Their lives are literally tied to somebody else. Typical interactions and opinions people have of Poplin are usually centered around the duo that they are a part of, since it includes both the Poplin and the bonded child, so privacy can sometimes be an issue. You also get a lot of scenarios where two people are very dependent on each other, making separation a bit of a chore. In that sense, both the Poplin and their bond can be a little childlike. As such, opinions generally change as time passes and the duo gets older. It's cool to have a talking toy friend when you're a kid, but it can cramp your style as an adult. Overall, I think that Poplin fill a unique niche that presents interesting questions for both player and Dungeon Master. Who am I bonded to? Will this character be part of my adventuring party? If not, how will we see each other? What kind of toy should I mimic? What is the origin of Poplin? The race also explores parts of life, like coming to terms with not being attached at the hip with your childhood friends and growing up in general. Here are some closing thoughts. I only went over a handful of races in order to showcase some big picture ideas on how races can impact character design from a story perspective. A toy whose main concern is helping out its brother probably isn't going to worry very much about acquiring glory for their clan, for instance. Races are a core part of fantasy and deserve to have thought put into them. Orcs serve as an important purpose in fantasy as the savage brutes to fill your combat encounters with, as much as they are the rough-around-the-edges warriors of the party. Poplin serve as perfect companions. They force you to think about what exists in the world outside of your character. Even if you don't adventure with your Poplin and Bond duo, it might end up anchoring you to a specific city or region, so you can always return to them to maintain the Poplin's sanity. Writing stories is an integral part of tabletop games, and race mechanics, while necessary, aren't the whole picture. A well-developed character that plays off a race's strengths can create a more memorable experience than any skill bonus or ability score increase ever could. And those are the kinds of moments a lot of people hope for when they join a campaign and dump dozens of hours into it. Hey y'all, thanks for watching my first YouTube video. If you'd like to hear about a specific topic, leave a comment and I'll try to include it in a future video. Subscribe if you want to see it. I love talking about game design in general, but tabletop RPGs are my favorite. I have links for my Discord server and the OneNote document. I've been writing my own TTRPG in the comments below. It's called Knickknacks, and it's most similar to Pathfinder 1st Edition. I regularly post some of my favorite or latest stuff on both my Discord server and my Twitter. But until next time, farewell, fellow gamers.